Here we are in sunny Spain. Wait. Here we are in sunny Spain, where the opera The Barber of Seville is set. I'm Charles Carson, Associate Professor of Musicology and Ethnomusicology at the Butler School of Music at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm happy to join you today to talk a little bit about Rossini's wonderful masterpiece. The first thing I like to do is talk to all of my newbies out there, people who are new to opera and are watching this video hoping to get a sense of like what's going to happen and what they should do on that night. Well, the first thing you might be wondering is what to wear. Well, don't worry about it. While some people are going to show up probably wearing ball gowns and tuxedos, that's really not important. Really, just be comfortable. We're happy to have you there regardless of what. So as long as you show up comfortable and ready to enjoy the show, we're happy to have you. The next thing you might be wondering, language. This opera is in Italian. What do I do if I don't speak Italian? Don't worry. You don't have to speak the language to follow along. Matter of fact, even native speakers will often use like a little book or a libretto, right, to sort of follow along moment to moment in an opera. But in our case, we don't have to worry about that because right here, right above stage, they're going to project a real-time translation of each line as it goes by. Now, don't get bogged down sort of following all of that. The way I suggest that you do it, the way I do it myself, is I just glance up really quickly to the top of the stage, get a sense of what they're talking about and singing about at that moment, and then boom, I'm right back paying attention to the action on stage. That way you can really let the music and words, the blending of those two things kind of carry you along throughout the performance. Now, the other part is, are they really going to sing the whole time? Yes, traditionally, opera is what we call sung through. That means that from the beginning to the end, they will be singing of some type. Now, in the opera, traditional opera, there are basically two types of singing. One, there's recitative. That is the kind of singing that is supposed to represent speaking dialogue. And it's kind of a blend of speaking and singing that follows the natural contours of the language, and of course, in this case, Italian. The second type is the aria, that kind of singing that's a song. It's very song-like, very sustained. Now that represents kind of the inner thoughts or the sort of, the moments of emotional sort of processing that's happening kind of internally or between characters. And you can imagine it being like a soliloquy or something, or an aside in a play, where the audience is hearing the thoughts and the emotions of the people as they're expressing them, even if it's in a duet or a trio or something, right? So those two types of singing, even though they're both singing, they're very different types of approaches, and you'll get a sense of kind of the difference between those. Now, in the hands of a master like Rossini, there's a definite sort of sense of a shift from the dialogic kind of talking to the sort of more soliloquy singing aria type. So that will be a fun way of sort of pacing yourself. They often alternate between like, the speaky talky recitative and the more lyrically oriented aria. An aria is for one person, but once you add a second person, that becomes a duet and a trio and a quartet, all the way up to something like an ensemble, which has a bunch of people and singing at the same time. But you'll notice this shift, and each scene will sort of move through like dialogue that kind of explains and moves the progress of the narrative forward, and then the arias, which enable the character and the audience to sort of sit back and reflect on what's happening in a deeply emotional way. So between those two things, you should have a pretty good time sort of getting a sense of what's going on in the work. Now, what is going on in the work? Rossini's Barber of Seville is a comic opera, traditionally what we call an opera buffa. And this comic opera tradition has a number of stock characters and stock situations that happen, not unlike sort of sitcoms today that have sort of stock, situations that kind of recur and we understand the humor behind them. There would have been a lot of this in this opera at that time. So the synopsis, the overall overarching story of the opera is actually kind of funny itself. There is a young woman, Rossina, who's sort of being held as a ward, right? Sort of like she's being cared for by this older guy, Dr. Bartolo. Dr. Bartolo intends to eventually marry her, even though there's a wide difference in age, and that becomes kind of a plot point throughout. But there's a young count, Almaviva, and the count himself has eyes for Rosina and is more age appropriate, I should say. And he decides to woo her, but he wants to woo her as just like an everyman, not as a sort of powerful, wealthy count. So he assumes a series of comedic sort of characters to make her sort of fall in love with him and woo her. And in the middle of that, there's all these other people who are trying to sort of either aid or help in these endeavors of these sort of two lovers to get together. The most notable is Figaro. So Figaro is, in fact, the Barber of Seville. And Figaro is sort of a jack of all trades. He sort of takes care of everything that has to happen in town, and people go to him to get things done, either whether it be a shave and a haircut or sort of help in wooing an intended lover. This is what happens. Almaviva comes to Figaro, asks him for help. Figaro sets up a series of scenarios, and hilarity ensues. That's the sort of instigating action for the plot, and a number of comic scenes will sort of follow out of this initial thread. So it's essentially a story about love. It's a story about flipping things over on their heads, where the powerful become the sort of the everyday people, and you make fun of people like the music professor and the doctor. All these people get made fun of who are traditionally in positions of power. It's a hilarious comic plot, and one that continues to entertain audiences generation after generation. Rossini was born in 1792 in Paesello, and with the child of two other musicians, he was effectively a child prodigy. He attended Bologna, and by 18, he had written his first opera. Over the next 20 years, he churned out 2, 3, or 4 operas a year for the Italian public. This was a time in which opera was so popular that you could not keep up with demand. He reused a lot of his materials, like many opera composers at that time did, pulling this aria from that piece or this aria from that. But even the overture to Barber of Seville, the piece we so closely associate with this piece, was in fact used earlier in an opera called Elizabeth, the Queen of England. That was about the reign of Elizabeth I. This is common practice at the time, this reusing of materials, at a time in which operas were composed within a matter of weeks. On average, probably 3 or 4 weeks to compose an entire opera. Some people say that this opera was written in as short as 2 weeks. Alongside Bellini and Donizetti, Rossini stands up as one of the big three of what we call the bel canto opera style composers. Bel canto refers to the sort of beautiful singing or beautiful voice tradition, a tradition where the composers are writing pieces of music effectively to show off the talents of individual singers. In the case of singers of this era, it would have been long runs and trills and high notes, all these sort of things to demonstrate what these individual singers can do. Later composers like Verdi would sort of soften this and integrate this better into the plots, into the actual sort of music and dramatic arc of the piece. But during this time, it was really about the sort of fireworks of the voices, and you'll hear a lot of that in this piece as well. So when we're sitting down to listen to this stuff, we really should be thinking about how all of this legacy, this earlier musical legacy of opera, is sort of feeding into this moment. For example, many people consider Rossini to be the heir to the Italian opera tradition set up by Mozart. Now, I know Mozart is German, but we still think about Mozart as being kind of the person who really moves forward the Italian opera tradition. And Rossini effectively ruled opera until the grand opera tradition sort of started pushing out some of the more popular sort of things that of the bel canto tradition. And of course, like I said, later Italian composers like Verdi and even beyond that, Puccini would integrate a lot of his innovations into their more dramatic and verismo style of operatic works. Barber of Seville was premiered in 1816 in the Teatro Argentina. in Rome. Don't get confused between Argentina and Rome. It, by all accounts, was a flop. The premiere went horribly, horribly wrong. It's one of these famous stories of bad premieres alongside stuff like The Rite of Spring or the other big opera bad premiere, Carmen, which of course became one of the workhorses of the operatic repertoire. Some people say it was because of the hurried nature of the performance. Again, these things are happening, being composed so quickly, the singers wouldn't have had as much time with the piece as they would have liked. But other people blame the fact that a rival, an earlier composer by the name of Paisiello, had written another setting of Barber of Seville. And this setting was very, very, very popular. And to have this sort of young upstart composer in the likeness of Rossini write another setting of this play seemed a little bit like a slight to Paisiello. And in fact, whether or not this is true, it doesn't really matter because it makes for a good story, right? So after disastrous premiere, the piece eventually gathered a pretty good following, and that's why we're all here today, because the piece was incredibly popular. It's based on a series of plays by the French playwright and writer Beaumarchais. Beaumarchais wrote three sort of chapters of this story. This is actually the first, right? The Barber of Seville. It's followed quickly on by The Marriage of Figaro, famously set by Mozart, and set before Rossini's version. So in many ways, Rossini is sort of giving you the prequel to The Marriage of Figaro, right? And the third, which is not really as popular, The Guilty Mother, La Mère Coupable, has only been set in a major setting by the French composer Darius Milhaud, but isn't really in the opera repertoire. So these three plays were very, very popular at their time and have been used multiple times by multiple composers. In fact, there are half a dozen, 10 maybe, settings of Barber of Seville, but of course this is the one that kind of stuck. But I do invite you to go check out the Paisiello version because it is of its time and gives you a sense of what was going on in opera at the time in which Rossini is developing his version. It's a lovely, lovely work with a lot of interesting plot turns and twists. What I would like to do is really focus on a couple of themes, right? First of all, the theme of love, which is motivating all of this sort of comedic situations that happen. But also this theme that's very big in The Marriage of Figaro, but that is introduced, again, this is the earlier play, even though it's the later opera, the theme of the sort of inversion of things. So the sense in this opera is that the most powerful person is going to be playing a lowly person in order to woo this woman who's effectively a commoner. At the same time, they're making fun of the establishment, again, education, the church, all these things in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way. And again, this is happening at a time in which the world is changing, right? If we go through the late 1700s into the early 1800s, we have a significant change in how Europe is organizing itself in the wake of stuff like the French Revolution. So this is also a timely opera, and in that way is kind of a commentary, a political satire, if you will, to a certain extent. It's a fascinating work, and I hope you enjoy it. Now, approaching a full opera can be very daunting. There's hours of music and a lot of stuff's going by, especially in a comedy like this where there's a lot of twists and turns of the plot. So for my own approach, I like to just think about a few key moments that we can sort of like latch onto and think about as a way of orienting ourselves through the music. Now, this opera is in 2 acts. Each act has a couple of different scenes in it. So I like to take a few moments from each act just as a way to sort of help guide ourselves through watching this long piece. But of course, the first place we have to start is with the famous aria that everyone knows from Bugs Bunny, Figaro's aria, his opening aria that we call Largo al Factotum, the sort of the entrance of the jack of all trades. And Figaro is the main character in The Marriage of Figaro, as you might imagine, but here he plays this as sort of a sidekick to the Count. And this aria is what's called an entrance aria. It's an aria that introduces this sort of side, eventually main character, and helps immediately tell the audience who he is and what he's about. Now, Figaro as a character is a factotum. He's the guy who sort of does everything for everyone around town. Now, as a barber, that's kind of his job. He cuts hair, he makes wigs, he pulls teeth, does some medical treatments, all these sort of things, and also helps people with like sort of little plots about matchmaking and other kind of sort of intrigue. This is where he enters our story. We learn who he is through this entrance aria, where he describes all the people who come to him and want pieces of him all the time. Figaro, will you do this? Figaro, can you help me with this? Figaro, can you help me with that? And he rattles off lists and lists and lists of things that people are asking him to do, and all the people who are coming from all across the city of Seville to ask him for these favors. And in this performance of this very, very, very famous aria, we learn that he is got his fingers in a lot of pies, and he's a very witty, sort of fast-thinking kind of a character. We know that because his singing style mirrors that, with very fast type of singing that's like a patter song, where he's repeating very fast words and very fast syllables very, very quickly, right? So in this case, when he's singing all of these syllables very, very quickly, it's not only a musical, like a virtuosic performance, which is again the bel canto, the singing, demonstrating the voice, but it's also a characteristic, right? We're learning about the character. This is where the actors can really shine as comedic actors and not just as amazing singers. So you really need a cast that can sort of pull this off, and it's all kind of based around this one character of Figaro. Now, this is probably one of the most famous musical moments in all of opera. Many of us have seen it. But when we're listening to it this time, think about how he's building in, Rossini is building in musical and character elements to showcase not only the performer, the person who's actually in our world, but also the character of Figaro, the person who is in fact in the world of the opera, and using both of these techniques as a way of demonstrating the richness of this comic world that we're building, right? It's a very, very fun aria. A lot of people really enjoy it. And of course, you'll hear the famous Figaro, 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 which is sort of a cadenza in which the singer gets to sort of show off how fast and how slow they can sing, and how quickly they can speed up and slow down. It's a virtuosic display, and it's so much fun. And every time you hear it, it's like the first time.
Figaro, son qua. Hey, Figaro, son qua. Figaro qua, Figaro là, Figaro qua, Figaro là, Figaro su, Figaro giù, Figaro su, Figaro giù. Nella città, nella città, nella città, nella città. Ah, bravo Figaro, bravo bravissimo, fortunatissimo, fortunatissimo, per verità. Hatte fortuna, non mancherà. Oh, il factatum della città, oh, il factatum della città, della città, della città, della città.
Now, the second key moment also comes in Act 1, which is one of my most favorite moments in all of opera, the soprano aria, Una voce poco fa. This is the entrance aria for Rosina, who's our heroine, who will be wooed by the Count with the help of Figaro. And this is, like all entrance arias, this is another opportunity for the singer to display their talents. Now, an interesting thing about this aria, it is written for a mezzo-soprano, or actually early on even a contralto, but we often sing it transposed up a step for pure sopranos to sing, so they could really show off some of that coloratura stuff. So you'll sometimes see a mezzo sing it, and sometimes see a pure soprano sing it. It's either way, it's fireworks, it's lightning crashing, it's beautiful, beautiful singing of the bel canto style of tradition. Now, what is happening in this aria is actually really, really, really fun. So again, entrance aria tells us about the singer and tells us about the character. So like many arias, it's broken down into two general sections. One, the sort of cantabile, the sort of singing part that's like slower, and then the second part, which is often called the cabaletta, which is a faster kind of chunk chunk chunk, kind of shows off more of the sort of vocal fireworks. Now, in this case, both of these sections are going to be used to build the character. In the first slower section, we're going to have Rossini introducing the sort of problem. She has fallen in love with the Count, who's in disguise at this point, and sings about hearing this voice from a ways ago, right? This voice is sort of echoes in her heart, and she sings very, very calmly and very demurely about how she wants this man to be hers. But then on repetitions of the phrase, she sort of explodes out, and these are opportunities for her to sort of show off her singing skills. So she says, I will win. He will be mine. I swear it. Io vincerò, right? And I will win. And so when she repeats that, she throws a whole bunch of scales and high notes and arpeggios on the word vincerò, like win, to demonstrate that she will in fact win. So even in the slower part of the first half of the aria, we still get a little bit of, there's more to the surface. There's more to her than just at the surface level, right? There's some depth to this character. But it really explodes in the second half of the aria. The second half of the aria, again, the sort of a cabaletta section, is a little faster, but she still sings. She starts singing with this very sort of quiet sort of voice where she sings, I'm docile, I'm obedient, I do what I'm told. And it's very sweet. And we know this because the music is telling us this. She sings with these sort of sighs, la, la, these sort of beautiful sighs. We have a nice dainty flute in the background that's like kind of tooting around behind her, that tells us, oh, she's very ladylike, she's very well behaved, she's very, very well raised. But, and that is an important moment on the Italian word ma, but she says, if you cross me, then I'm a snake, I'm a viper, and I'll bite and snap. And the music shifts on that word, ma. And this is one of those moments where the acting ability of the soprano can really, really, really be shown, because this one syllable, perhaps more than any other single syllable in all of opera, affords the opportunity for a character shift from this docile, obedient, good girl to this powerful, powerful woman. And it all changes, all shifts right on that one syllable, but ma. Right? So listen for that in this performance. But how will the actor use ma to sort of signal this shift? That is both a character shift and a musical shift. And the second half of that ma phrase, if someone crosses me, then I'm a viper that will bite. You'll hear that in the music through all of these runs and scales and leaps, and again transposed up for soprano, very, very high notes, that they're really demonstrating this sort of bel canto sort of fireworks singing tradition that is through twists and turns in the vocal line, the snake sort of biting and snapping and winding its way through these melodies. It's a very evocative moment that is both musically, it makes sense musically, and it makes sense as a character device. So really pay attention to how that ma plays out and what happens after that. The final key moment is the final moment, the finale of the entire opera that happens at the end of Act Two. And operatic finales are kind of a curious thing because going back to the time of Mozart, not before, they were effectively the stacking of arias, right? So if you have an aria with one person, it's called an aria, a solo. Then two people is a duet, and three people is a trio and quartet, and then all the way up until we have what we call an ensemble. And if that ensemble happens at the end of an act or the end of something, it's called the finale. And of course, the end of the entire piece is the finale. So much like in the Mozartian tradition, Rossini is going to build this nice little scene that leads right to the end of the opera with the last few moments of sort of comic tricks and turns in the plot line that build up emotionally, even as the music is also building up emotionally by adding more people and all this stuff. So the finale is a fun time to sort of see it sort of starting. And, you know, one of the first sort of fun parts of the finale is this is a moment, the zitti moment, where they're quietly sort of sneaking, trying to get out from the apartment before they're discovered. But what happens here is they are all sort of trapped in there, and more people keep coming into the scene until finally the Count has to reveal himself as the Count and not some poor musician. And at that point, everyone's like, whoa, what happened? And you know, of course, what we call a banana peel moment, where Dr. Bartolo will come in with the police, like, we're going to arrest you. It's like, you can't arrest him. He's the Count. And it's just hilarious. It's just sort of a very farcical moment in terms of plot that is mirrored in this sort of stacking of all these musical events. So finally, at the end, everyone is all these plot lines are resolved, and everyone sings the actual finale, a section called Amor e Fede Eterna, which is an ode to love and faith, and they all sort of come together into this sort of happy ending. You know, at least until the next story picks up where this one leaves off, and it's a beautiful moment that sort of ties all of this piece together, both in terms of the themes of like love and the reversal of fortunes, as well as musically. It's a nice big, beautiful sort of musical dollop of whipped cream at the end of a delightful piece. So thank you for joining me in this brief introduction to the Barber of Seville. It's a lovely piece, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. I hope this short video will just increase that enjoyment. I really look forward to meeting you face to face. So if you see me at the performance, just feel free to yell, "Hey, Charles!" and I'll come running just like a factotum. Thank you.